The slap echoed through the cafe like a gunshot. Every conversation stopped. Every cup froze midair. The man who had just been struck stood completely still, one hand resting flat on the table, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the man across from him. Derek Lawson was laughing loud, confident, performing for an audience he assumed was on his side. He had just called Nathan Cole a broke failure, a nobody in dirty work clothes. He had no idea that the man standing in front of him had survived operations that didn't exist on any official record. He was about to find out. The cafe on Mercer Street was the kind of place that didn't try too hard. The chairs didn't match, the lighting was low and warm, and the woman behind the counter, a heavy-set woman in her 50s named Gloria, knew every regular by their order. It wasn't trendy. It wasn't loud. That was exactly why Nathan Cole came here every weekday at 4:30, without fail, like a man honoring a small private agreement with himself. He had been coming for almost 2 years. Since he moved back to the city, since he traded the structure of military life for sawdust and silence, and the slow satisfaction of building something with his hands. He worked long hours as a carpenter, took jobs wherever they came, and spent most of his evenings alone in a rented house that was too big for one person, but served its purpose. The cafe was the one stop between work and home, where he allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to let the day settle before it became the next one. Nathan didn't look like a man with a history. That was the honest truth of it. He was broad-shouldered and lean, the kind of build that comes not from a gym, but from years of actual physical labor, first in the field, then in the workshop. His flannel shirt was faded, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, his forearms marked with old scars he never explained to anyone. He kept his hair short out of habit, and his face largely unreadable. To anyone who glanced at him in passing, he was just another working man with dirt under his fingernails, and nowhere particular to be. He ordered black coffee the same as always. Gloria set it down in front of him with a brief nod, the way people communicate when words have long since become unnecessary. Nathan wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the front window at the street. A delivery truck was backing into an alley. 2 women were walking fast heads down against the late afternoon wind. The city moved at its usual pace, indifferent, efficient, unaware of itself. He had been sitting there for about 15 minutes when the door opened. The man who walked in didn't enter so much as arrive. Derek Lawson was somewhere in his mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a white shirt that looked like it cost more than Nathan's weekly groceries. His hair was styled in that deliberately effortless way that requires a great deal of effort. He was on the phone speaking loudly enough that the entire cafe could hear both sides of the conversation, whether they wanted to or not. He didn't lower his voice when he stepped inside. He didn't look at anyone when he approached the counter. He simply assumed the space was ready for him, the way men like him always assumed. Gloria greeted him the way she greeted everyone, steady, neutral, professional. She took his order, explained that the espresso machine had been running slow because of a maintenance issue that morning, and told him it would be about 4 minutes. Derek pulled the phone from his ear, long enough to look at her, like she had said something genuinely offensive. 4 minutes, he repeated, not as a question, as a verdict. Gloria said yes, 4 minutes, and turned back to the machine. Derek turned around and surveyed the cafe with the expression of a man who had expected better and was personally disappointed in everyone present. His gaze moved across the room without landing on anything with interest until it found Nathan sitting at the small table by the window, old shirt, worn boots, calloused hands resting around a plain mug of black coffee. Something shifted in Derek's posture, the kind of shift that happens when a certain type of man identifies a target that feels safe. He walked over not to speak to Nathan, but to take the table directly beside him, despite the fact that 3 other tables were empty. He sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and resumed his phone call. The conversation was about a deal that had fallen through, and Derek's version of events placed the blame squarely and loudly on everyone except himself. He used the word incompetent 3 times in 2 minutes. He used amateur twice. The cafe, which had previously been quiet enough to hear the coffee machine working, was now functioning as an unwilling audience for one man's performance. Nathan said nothing. He kept his eyes on the window and his hands around his mug. Derek ended the call and looked sideways at Nathan, the way a person looks at something they find both boring and irritating at the same time. He let a moment go by, then he said loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "Hard day at the job site." Nathan glanced at him. "Decent day." Derek smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind that carries a small blade inside it. "What do you do, build fences? Pour concrete?" He looked Nathan over with open appraisal, his eyes stopping at the worn shirt, the rough hands, the absence of anything that could pass for status. "I'm just asking because guys like you always look like the day crushed them a little." The woman at the next table shifted in her seat. A man near the back lowered his newspaper. Nathan kept his voice flat and even. "I do carpentry work." "Carpentry." Derek nodded slowly, as if filing this information under the category of things that confirmed his assumptions. "Good for you. Honest work." The way he said honest made it sound like a polite substitute for another word entirely. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the cafe with a theatrical kind of weariness. "I don't know how people do it, honestly. Wake up every day to do the same physical thing with their hands, go home tired, get up, and do it again. No real future in it. No growth." He glanced at Nathan again. "Doesn't that get to you? Knowing you've basically topped out?" The cafe had grown noticeably quieter. Gloria had stopped moving behind the counter. The couple by the door had stopped their conversation. People were not staring directly. They were doing that careful sideways kind of attention that people adopt when something uncomfortable is happening, and no one has yet decided what to do about it. Nathan set his mug down. "You should probably keep that kind of opinion to yourself." It was said without heat, without any particular edge. It was a plain statement, the kind of thing a man says when he means exactly what he says, and nothing more than that. But to Derek, it apparently registered as a challenge. His expression changed. The performance shifted into something with a little more purpose behind it. "Oh, I should—" Derek turned fully in his seat to face Nathan now. His voice had gotten louder, and there was a new quality to it, the particular aggression of someone who has decided that the person across from him doesn't have the standing to push back. "Let me tell you something. I've been in meetings this week that would make your head spin. I've closed deals that fund more jobs than you'll ever work in your life. So forgive me if I don't take life advice from a man who smells like a workshop and can't afford a coffee shop that actually functions properly." A few people in the cafe looked away. A few looked directly at Nathan. Nathan looked at Derek for a long moment. There was nothing reactive in his face, no flush of embarrassment, no tightening around the eyes. He simply looked at the man in front of him, the way a person looks at weather, as something that exists, that has to be dealt with, but that doesn't require an emotional response. "Last time," Nathan said, "keep it civil." And that apparently was the wrong thing to say. Derek stood up from his chair. The movement was fast and slightly unsteady, the way a man moves when his temper has gotten slightly ahead of his judgment. He took the half-step between their tables and in front of everyone in the cafe brought his open hand across Nathan's face with a sharp, flat crack that hit the walls and came back. The sound hung in the air. Derek stood over Nathan with his chest rising, breathing a little faster than normal, clearly surprised by what he'd just done, but covering it with the kind of defiant stillness that happens when a person is committed and can't walk it back. He held his chin up and looked at the room as if searching for confirmation that what he'd done had the effect he'd intended. He found none. The cafe had gone completely uniformly silent. Nathan had not fallen. He had not stumbled. He hadn't moved at all, except to turn his face back to its original position, looking directly at Derek. His hands were resting flat on the table, both of them perfectly still. The redness of the impact was visible across his left cheek. His expression had not changed in any way that Derek could likely describe or explain. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shock. It was something quieter and far harder to read the look of a man who has been through enough that a slap in a cafe doesn't register as the most difficult thing his body has ever experienced. He just looked at Derek, and Derek, for the first time since walking through that door, had nothing to say. Nobody moved. That was the thing that struck the room first. Not what had just happened, but the complete and total absence of any response to it. No one stood up. No one said anything. The woman 2 tables over had both hands wrapped around her cup and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, as if she were trying to will herself out of the room. The man near the back had folded his newspaper and set it on the table with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who is buying time while deciding what to do next. Gloria stood behind the counter with one hand resting on the machine and her jaw set in a hard, flat line. The cafe had become the kind of silent that has weight to it, the kind that presses down. Derek still hadn't sat back down. He was standing between the 2 tables with his hand at his side, the one he'd used, and his chest still moving a little too fast. The performance had landed differently than he'd planned. He had expected something, a flinch, a stumble, maybe a trembling voice asking him to calm down. He had expected the usual response that a certain kind of power usually produces in a certain kind of person. Instead, Nathan Cole had done nothing, and the nothing was somehow louder than anything Derek had anticipated. Nathan stood up from his chair. He didn't do it quickly. He didn't do it the way a man rises when he's about to throw something back. He simply unfolded himself from the seat with a slowness that had more control in it than speed ever could. And when he was fully upright, he was taller than Derek had apparently expected, because Derek took one small, involuntary step backward before catching himself. Nathan looked at him directly, without heat, without performance, without any of the social signals that tell a person what's coming next. His face was unreadable in a way that went beyond calm. It was the face of a man so thoroughly trained to control his own reactions that the absence of expression had become an expression in itself. Derek recovered quickly, the way people do when their ego is working faster than their instincts. He let out a short laugh, the kind designed to reset a room, and looked around at the other customers. "What?" he said to no one in particular. "Guy lets himself get pushed around all day, and I'm supposed to feel bad about it." He spread his hands like a man making a reasonable argument. "I'm doing him a favor. Some people need to hear what the rest of us already know." He turned back to Nathan, and the smile returned thinner, this time the blade closer to the surface. "You going to stand there all day? Or are you going to do something?" It was a direct provocation. The room recognized it and tightened. Nathan said nothing. He stood exactly where he was, and he kept his eyes on Derek with that same flat, empty steadiness. It was the look of a man who had calculated 17 different ways the next 30 seconds could go and had simply decided which one he preferred. Derek's smile faltered, just slightly, just enough that the people watching from nearby tables caught it, even if Derek himself didn't. The silence stretched. Derek opened his mouth, presumably to say something that would fill it, and that was when a chair scraped against the floor at the back of the room. An older man rose from a corner table. He was somewhere in his late 60s, with the kind of build that had once been significant and still carried the memory of it. His hair was silver and cut close, his posture straight in the manner of a man who had spent decades in environments where posture was not optional. He wore a plain button-down shirt and a canvas jacket, nothing that advertised anything about him. He had been sitting alone with a cup of coffee and a folder of papers, and until this moment, no one had paid him any particular attention. He walked toward the front of the cafe at an unhurried pace, not toward Derek, toward Nathan. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Nathan for a moment, with an expression that contained something complicated recognition, and something adjacent to grief, and something that might have been respect, worn smooth by time. Then he said in a voice that was quiet, but carried clearly through the silence of the room. Major Cole. 2 words. That was all. The title hit the room differently than anything else that had been said in the past 10 minutes. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a fact being stated by a person who had been present for the facts, the way a name gets said, when both people in a conversation know exactly how much weight it carries. Nathan looked at the older man. Something moved through his expression, brief and controlled, quickly returned to neutral. "Colonel Hale," he said. Richard Hale stood with both hands at his sides and looked at Derek Lawson with the particular kind of assessment that comes from a lifetime of accurately reading dangerous situations. Derek, for his part, was already recalibrating. The entrance of this older man, the exchange of those titles, something had shifted in the architecture of the room, and Derek could feel it, even if he didn't yet understand it. Colonel Hale spoke to Derek. Not loudly, not with any visible anger, the way a person states coordinates. "The man you just put your hand on," he said, "served this country for over 17 years, in a unit most people in this room have never heard of, and never will. He ran operations in places that don't appear on any briefing, that gets declassified in our lifetimes. He was decorated 3 times for actions I'm not at liberty to describe, and there are men still alive today, men with families and careers and ordinary lives, because of decisions Nathan Cole made under conditions that would have broken most human beings inside of 48 hours. Colonel Hale's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He left the service quietly because that's the kind of man he is. He builds things with his hands now, and he drinks coffee in the afternoon, and he has never once asked anyone to know his name. Derek's face had changed completely. The easy confidence had drained out of it, the way color drains from a face in shock, fast, and all at once. He looked at Nathan with new eyes, the kind of eyes that come with the sudden, sickening realization that you have been making a very serious error in judgment for the past 15 minutes, and that there is no version of the recent past you can take back. "I didn't," Derek started. "That's correct," Colonel Hale said simply, and turned away from him. The room absorbed that. The man near the back had stopped pretending to look at his newspaper. The woman with the cup had set it down. Gloria was watching from behind the counter with her arms crossed, her expression doing something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. Derek turned to Nathan directly. The cockiness was gone, stripped out, completely replaced by something raw and unpracticed, the expression of a man who has no prepared response for the situation he's now standing in. "Look," he said, and his voice had lost its projection, flattened out to something closer to its actual register. "I didn't know. Okay, I had no idea who you were. If I had known—" Nathan looked at him. The sentence died where it stood. There was something in Nathan's eyes, not fury, not the hot, readable anger that Derek could have worked with, or deflected, or outpaced. It was something far more difficult to manage, the complete absence of the need to prove anything. Nathan didn't need Derek to be scared of him. He didn't need the room to be impressed by him. He didn't need the moment to be anything other than exactly what it was. And that absence of need, that total indifference to whether Derek understood what he was standing across from, was the most frightening thing Derek had encountered in a very long time. Derek tried again. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time since walking through the door of the cafe, he actually sounded like he meant it. "I was out of line. Everything I said, the way I treated you, it was wrong. I know that." Nathan let the apology exist in the air for a moment. Then he said, "I heard you. Not accepted, not dismissed, just acknowledged. As if the apology were a weather event, something that had occurred, been registered, and would not meaningfully change the landscape." Derek searched Nathan's face for something to work with, some indication that the apology had softened the ground, that a path had opened. He found nothing. Nathan was simply looking at him with that steady level attention, and the longer the eye contact held, the more Derek seemed to feel the full weight of what he'd done. Not the legal weight of it, not the social weight of being seen to do it, but something more personal and harder to shake. The understanding that he had walked up to a man who could have put him through the window without raising his heart rate, and had decided that man was worth mocking. That the measure he'd used to take Nathan's worth had been so far off from the actual number that the gap between them couldn't be calculated in any currency Derek was familiar with. The color in Derek's face had settled into something dull and fixed. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair his coffee had never arrived and straightened it with hands that weren't quite steady. He looked once more at Nathan, who hadn't moved, and then at Colonel Hale, who was now seated again at his corner table, as if nothing of particular note had occurred. Derek looked around the cafe at the faces that were no longer bothering to look away, and found no allies, no sympathy, nothing that reflected back the version of events he'd walked in believing. Nathan's voice came before Derek reached the door, even-toned, unraised, carrying across the room without effort. "Go home," Nathan said. "Think about why you did that. Not to me, I'm fine. Think about why that's what you reached for." Derek didn't answer. He pushed through the door and walked out onto Mercer Street, and the door swung shut behind him, and the cafe let out a collective breath that no one had planned. The afternoon light was the same as it had been. The delivery truck in the alley had gone. The two women Nathan had watched from the window were long gone. The city outside was moving the way it always moved, indifferent, efficient, unaware of itself. Inside, someone set a cup down. Someone else started a quiet conversation. Gloria turned back to the machine behind the counter and resumed her work without comment, which was perhaps the most dignified response available to anyone in the room. Nathan sat back down. He put both hands around his coffee mug, which had gone cold, and he looked out the window for a long time without saying anything. The cafe didn't return to normal all at once. It returned in pieces. First, the sound, the low hum of the espresso machine resuming its work, the small ceramic sounds of cups being moved and spoons being set down. Then the conversation starting at the back of the room and moving forward slowly the way water finds its level after something has disturbed it. Within a few minutes, the surface of the place looked the way it always looked, ordinary, unhurried, warm. But the people in it carried the last half hour with them in their posture, in the way they glanced at Nathan's table, in the particular quiet that lingers after a room has collectively witnessed something it didn't expect. Nobody approached Nathan directly. That was its own kind of respect, the understanding that the man at the window table hadn't asked to be the center of anything, and probably wasn't interested in becoming it now. The woman who'd been sitting 2 tables over gathered her things and left with a brief, deliberate look in his direction. Not a stare, not a comment, just a look that acknowledged something without needing to name it. The man who'd folded his newspaper stood and buttoned his coat and walked past Nathan's table, and he nodded once, a short, firm movement, before he pushed out through the front door. Gloria came out from behind the counter. She didn't say anything about what had happened. She picked up Nathan's cold mug, took it back, and returned a few minutes later with a fresh cup of black coffee, set it in front of him, and went back to her station without asking to be thanked. Nathan looked down at the new cup for a moment. Then he wrapped both hands around it the way he always did. Both hands, thumbs forward. The mug held like something worth holding, and he went back to looking out the window. At the corner table, Colonel Richard Hale had returned to his folder of papers. He had the focused, unhurried quality of a man who had learned long ago not to let the world rush him. He read for a while. He made a note in the margin of something. He finished his coffee. Then he closed the folder, set it aside, and looked across the room at Nathan for a long moment before he picked up his cup, rose from his seat, and walked over. He didn't ask permission to sit. He simply pulled out the chair across from Nathan with one hand and settled into it with the ease of a man who has shared enough difficult spaces with another person to consider social formalities beside the point. Nathan looked at him. Colonel Hale set his empty cup on the table and leaned back in the chair and looked out the window alongside Nathan, as if whatever Nathan was watching out there was worth watching. A full minute passed that way. Two men looking at the street. Colonel Hale was the one who spoke first. "He hit you in front of a room full of people," he said. His voice was level factual, carrying no particular charge. "And you just stood there." Nathan didn't answer right away. He took a slow drink from his mug and set it back down. "I know what I did." "I'm not criticizing it," Colonel Hale said. "I watched the whole thing. I want to understand it." He turned to look at Nathan directly. "You could have ended that at any point. Before the slap, certainly after. You had every justification. The room would have understood." He studied Nathan's face with the kind of attention that comes from a lifetime of needing to read people accurately and quickly. "So what stopped you?" Nathan looked down at his hands resting on the table. The scars on his forearms were visible in the low, warm light. A long one along the left forearm, two smaller ones on the back of the right hand. Not decorations. Evidence, the record of specific moments in specific places that no longer officially existed. He looked at them the way a person looks at something familiar, not with sentiment, not with pride, simply with recognition. "I've been in situations," Nathan said, "where the violence was necessary, where everything depended on being faster than the other person, harder than the other person, more willing than the other person to do what needed doing." He kept his voice quiet, unhurried. "I know exactly what that costs, not just to the person on the receiving end. I know what it does on the other side, too." He took another drink of coffee. "Derek Lawson is a loud, insecure man who made a bad decision in public. That doesn't put him on the same list as the people I've had to make hard choices about. Not even close." Colonel Hale said nothing. He let Nathan keep going, the way you let a man finish a thought he's been carrying for a while. "If I'd hit him," Nathan continued, "what would I have proven that I could? I already know that. He'd know it for 30 seconds until the adrenaline wore off, and then he'd be nursing a bruised face and a story about how he got jumped by some lunatic in a cafe, and none of it would have meant anything." He looked out the window again. The way it actually went, him standing there knowing what he didn't know, knowing what he'd just done, and what could have followed and didn't, that's going to stay with him longer than a broken nose would have. Colonel Hale listened to all of this. Then he said, "You've thought about this?" Nathan gave a small, single sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I've had time." The colonel looked at him for a moment with that same worn, complicated expression he'd carried when he first said Nathan's name, a look that contained respect and something heavier underneath it, the weight of shared history that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be present in the room. "You were one of the best operators I ever worked with," he said. "I mean that in the operational sense, but I think I mean it in other ways too." He turned and looked back out the window. "You always knew what force was actually for. Most people don't." Nathan didn't respond to that directly. He finished the last of his coffee and set the mug down with a quiet final sound. Around them, the cafe had settled fully back into its normal register. The couple by the door had resumed their conversation. Gloria was handling a new customer at the counter. The light through the front window was going gold as the afternoon tipped toward evening. The whole room looked like nothing had happened, which was, Nathan thought, exactly how a room should look after something gets handled correctly. He pulled on his jacket, and the same worn canvas jacket he'd come in with, the one that didn't advertise anything about him, and reached into his pocket for a few folded bills. He set them on the table, enough to cover the coffee, and something extra for Gloria, and he stood up. Colonel Hale looked up at him from the chair. "You doing all right, Nathan?" The question was simple and direct, and clearly meant more than its surface. It was the kind of question that two people who have been through significant things together ask each other when they haven't had the chance to ask in a long time, a question that really means, are you managing? Is the life you built working for you? Are you okay in the ways that matter? Nathan thought about it genuinely for a second or two. He thought about the rented house and the workshop in the back, and the particular satisfaction of watching something take shape under his hands, from raw material into something useful and solid and true. He thought about how quiet the evenings were, and how the quiet didn't feel like absence anymore, how at some point in the last 2 years, it had started to feel like something he'd actually chosen. He thought about afternoons in this cafe, the unmatched chairs and the low light, and Gloria who knew his order and never asked him questions he didn't want to answer. "Yeah," he said. "I'm doing all right." Colonel Hale nodded once. He looked like he believed it. Nathan picked up his things and moved toward the front of the cafe. He passed the table where the woman had been sitting now, empty and wiped clean. He passed the place where Derek Lawson had stood, that specific patch of floor between 2 tables that had contained so much noise 30 minutes ago and now contained nothing at all. He didn't look at it. He walked to the door and pushed it open, and the late afternoon air came at him cool and direct, carrying the smell of exhaust and concrete and the faint bite of coming rain. Behind him through the glass, the cafe went on. Gloria moved behind the counter. Someone laughed at something. The machine ran. Nathan walked down Mercer Street with his hands in his jacket pockets, heading in the direction of home, and the city moved around him the way it always did. Indifferent, efficient, unaware of itself, and he moved through it the same way a man who looked like nothing in particular to anyone passing by, carrying everything that he was in total silence, the way he had always carried it, the way he had decided was the only way that made sense anymore. The red mark on his jaw from the slap would fade by morning. He had carried worse. He had carried far worse in places and circumstances that no one in that cafe would ever have full access to. And he had come out the other side of all of it and built a life that was small and honest and entirely his own. A life with no audiences and no titles and no one who needed to know what he was capable of. That in the end was what the capability was actually. For not to be used on a loud man in a blazer who needed to feel large in a room, but to be held in reserve quietly and completely as the thing that never needed to be proven because it was never in any doubt. Nathan turned the corner at the end of the block and was gone. The street was ordinary in every direction.